Would you please say something about your background and how you're here and your interest in the project? It would be the same.
I started with a love of flying, and over the years I went from job to job to job, and now that I'm 30, it's time for me to go back to school and follow my dream. And here I am.
And what about the project? What have you learned so far? What would you say?
Oh, wow. I've met some of the most interesting people that I don't think I would have ever had an opportunity to if it wasn't for this. And just the background and the history of all these different characters that started this era is almost lost. And I think that this is a very good project to be a part of.
Well, you're the right age for that, actually. We have a son who's 30, and he's finding himself just about where you are. We picked him up from LAX last night. He just spent 3 days at Austin because he's just about to embark upon his PhD studies in history at the University of Texas after having been away from school for, let's say, 5 years, 6 years, and now having right on the edge of completing his master's in history. So he's ready to go back. He'll probably spend the rest of his life one way or the other being involved in that, be my guess.
Yeah. Good deal.
Is he interested in aviation history?
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. But that's not his. That's not his course of study. But very much so, because of course he was raised around airplanes.
Well, I'm AJ Smith. I grew up in Prescott, Arizona, and I'm in business administration. I like doing these oral history projects. I did one in high school where we documented different decades, and it was really interesting. I had the oldest decade we did, which was the 20s, and to learn the stories from that. Everyone has amazing stories, and history's just, it's amazing how we've moved from then to now. So I enjoy capturing this kind of history.
And what have you learned from this project?
From this project, I've learned that there was a whole section of aviation history that no one ever talks about, where the government was pretty much stopping every single movement towards capitalism and helping out these couple airlines to make them a monopoly or an oligopoly. It fascinates me that at the same time we had the MacArthur people saying, no, we can't have communism, and yet we had the CAB like saying, oh, well, we can't have capitalism.
Well, I'll tell you, this is a specific example of that, AJ. There was a fellow by the name of Hardy McClay. Hardy McClay was the attorney who represented not just North American Airlines, but some of the other carriers, and a very capable attorney in Washington, D.C. And he lived in Alexandria, Virginia. And he was advised that if he continued to represent these companies, he would be a marked man in Washington, and any of his desires to have further advancement in the aviation field would be finished. And he did not succumb to the pressure. Politically, the airlines, my dad's in particular, were run out of business. And Hardy McClay never got another job in Washington. Mm-hmm. Amazing, huh? But not so amazing.
Yeah.
But you see, you said capitalism. You know, there are many aspects of capitalism. Actually, what you're talking about, I believe there are 5 basic trunk carriers at that time, that was the kind of capitalism that in earlier times gave rise to unions because of the abuses of the capitalists. Entrepreneurial capitalism is a different kind. And so what you're talking about really of the entrepreneurial nature is probably seriously squelched, yes, but it was squelched by a superior and older cousin. So.
Yeah. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction, and I'll ask you then to have an introduction to how this all evolved. In our phone call a couple weeks ago, and again, Bill Thompson,
and I have worked for Embry-Riddle for 17 years. I'm a graduate of Embry-Riddle, but I left and came back, and right now I work for the university in the position of Director of Alumni Relations, but I've also worked public relations, external relations, government relations, and I was Director of Admissions, Enrollment Management, Financial Aid and Marketing for 12 years, and sometimes for both campuses simultaneously. My interest in this did not exist 2 years ago. It was a casual meeting, bumping into Hal, walking through the hallway, and he had jeans on. And when he dresses casual, he looks pretty casual, and a ball cap on. And I bumped into Hal, and he said, "I'm speaking here tonight, and I'm not sure where to go." And I went, "All right, sir, well, come into my office, let's figure it out." I had no idea who he was. And it might have been 3 years ago. From that point forward, Hal he would spoon feed me pieces of information. And then one day he brought a 5-course meal out. The book he wrote, David versus Goliath, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's out there. And there's only 3 copies printed so far. But Hal started providing me information. And with that, all of a sudden, he said, "I want to bring the Arizona Pioneers Association." I'm part of this group. Aviation Pioneers Association, more than one group out there. And he said, we're looking for a place to put our display. Non-skeds are being erased. Nobody understands this information. And we have this group that was 600 strong at one time, and it's down to handfuls of us. And this information will be lost. Many people have tried to write books, but nobody's capturing this. Well, we worked on this, and we said, we can take that display. So we have what was down at Burbank Airport is now in our library, and we should have brought a picture on it. We did the ribbon cutting Thursday, so 2 days ago. And we have a display. And it's a glass case display. And when you get off our elevator, second floor of our new library, which it's called the Stephen Udvar and Christine Haase Library and Learning Center, and I know you know that name.
Yes, I do.
And it's a beautiful facility. And right there, you walk out, and here's the non-sked display. So this whole thing became then a grant from the APA to capture the history, and this is where the students were brought in. Because bringing students and the history together are 2 very important factors to this whole project. So that is where we are here today, and traveled. You came from Vegas yesterday, and you traveled with us in the van. But we want to capture this history, and we want to grab the passion. And everybody here, at the end of every interview, we go, okay, this is even bigger than we thought it was, because it continues to grow. And that is the exciting part. One of the words said the other day that I thought was appropriate is that these mavericks are gone. Nobody can be a maverick the way these individuals were. They got a hold of the aircraft inexpensively from the military. They worked forward. They had their own entrepreneurial spirit, and they did things. They sold gas out of the aircraft. To pay for the aircraft. They did flights carrying cargo that most of us today you can't carry. So that's where we're at. And it's interesting because for these guys, they're learning so many things that they know would be taboo now. As we have the sound check man over there.
He's going to be coughing the whole time, so I'm going to have to mute his mic on the back. So just one click there.
You feel better? Okay. You feel better now.
I don't know, you're talking about mavericks. I don't know if you all are aware of this. You probably are, that air travel, certainly in the United States, before the non-skeds, was all one class and unaffordable by the majority of people. The non-skeds are the ones that made air travel economically available for most anybody who could, most anybody who had a job. For example, I don't know if I could locate the brochure. If I could, I'd get it for you. Hal probably has one. You could fly nonstop across the country on my dad's airline for $99. They filled the airplanes. Those airplanes were full. they typically flew in the high 90s to 100% occupancy. That made a big difference because when I was talking to you the other day and mentioned that at first Douglas Aircraft salespeople did not want to sell the current aircraft to North American Airlines. The reason for that was because if your competitor who is operating at $99 a head is flying the same aircraft as you, and the flight time is the same whether you fly your $99 competitor versus your fare of $300 or $400, that was something the big airlines did not want to have to face. And in fact, that was accurate as far as their concerns, because what happened was they had to cut their fares to compete with the airlines that were doing that. And in cutting their airfares like that, they developed, the first class versus the economy class. That was the genesis of economy class, was these people who came from the war. Every one of these guys that got into it initially, post-World War II, was ex-military. And if you were ex-military, you were entitled to bid on the surplus equipment and be given priority. And I know that my dad told me that when he was in India, he was the youngest flight officer at his base. They flew the hump. He also was the check pilot, and because he was the youngest officer, he was also stuck with the job of morale, which meant running the officers' club. And he was a pretty good gambler. That's one of the reasons probably he got into the airline business, because taking risk apparently didn't bother him. And he saved up $10,000, which he had sent home, in his allotment. And when he got back here to Long Beach, my mother wanted to buy a lot of property here, property right next to the airport over at Lakewood Country Club for $5,000 or some such sum. He said, no, that's way too much money. And he took the $10,000 and bought 2 C-47s surplus at Norton Air Force Base out here. And that's how he got started with that first $10,000. In his mind, when he came back, he didn't have that planned. But he knew he had all the money in the world because he had $10,000 in the bank. And there couldn't be any more money than that. He'd never seen that kind of money. And that's what he had saved. And he only knew 2 things for sure. 1, he was never going to shovel snow again. And 2, he was never going to roll another pill. Because he had grown up in West Oklahoma, and when he was 17, he was a good student, a very small town called Gotebo. He ended up going to Columbia University, and he wanted to be a doctor, but because they didn't have any money, he couldn't go to medical school, but he finished the School of Pharmacology and became a pharmacist, and was a druggist. And ended up being a detail man for Hoffman LaRoche, and he learned how to fly before World War II because there were floods in the New York area, and at Caldwell, New Jersey, there was a cinder, wasn't cement, but a cinder-covered field, and that was an airfield. And there was a sign that said, I forget what the price was, probably $5, fly over the floods. And so he ended up flying with this fellow by the name of Roy Ryder, was his name, the instructor, and that's where my dad learned how to fly. So when the war erupted, he joined the military, and he was already a qualified pilot, and one thing led to the other. And so that's how he got in that business. So when he came back from the war and all of those experiences, again, he knew he was never going to shovel snow, and he was never going to roll a pill again.
What was the name of that airline?
To start with,
Yes.
it was called Standard Airlines to start with.
How many years did Standard Airlines operate for?
I don't think it was more than 3 or 4 years, because they combined with an outfit called Viking Airlines
To make North American?
to make North American. They changed the name to Trans-American because North American Aviation sued them and said that the name would cause confusion because North American Aviation made aircraft, was in the aviation business, and so that's why they changed the name of the airline to Trans-American. And that would have been in, I think, the mid-50s, something like that.
And then it was Transamerican for how long?
I can't give you the date, but I can tell you it was sometime in 1957 when the CAB ordered them out of business. And this gets back to we were talking about supplemental carriers. There was always provision in the Aviation Act of 1938 for supplemental carriers. And you all will know better than I because I've not made a study of this, but I believe the test was that you could be a supplemental carrier as long as you didn't fly more than 10 flights a month between 2 points, the same 2 points. What North American / Transamerican did is they established an agency that presented itself and advertised first as North American, then as Transamerican, but it was really airlines agency. And then they had all of these operating certificates to own the different aircraft, and then they contracted with their operating carriers so that not one of those carriers flew more than 10 flights a month between the same 2 points. And the case went all the way through the CAB, and the CAB ruled, in essence, while you didn't violate the letter of the law, you violated the spirit of the law, and issued a cease and desist order. The airline went through the appellate process, and the death knell was when the U.S. Supreme Court denied a petition for certiorari to have this decision reviewed, and that was the end of the airline as such. Now, one of their airlines, however, was a company called 20th Century Aircraft, and it had a certificate. So even though the airline as such lawfully ceased doing business, over a period of time they started up again flying what are called CAMs for the military, and they contracted with the military flying typically, for example, first time I went to Japan, we went on one of my dad's airplanes. And it was supposed to be a deadhead from here to Tachikawa Air Force Base outside of Tokyo. So we were supposed to ride on the airplane, empty airplane. We had some friends with us, and so that's how we were going over there. Then the plane was going to fly a load back. Because of the nature of the military personnel movements, there also would be so many passengers have to get from A to B, and it's put out for open bid. So between the time the trip was planned and we were to get on the airplane, that airplane was filled. So instead of going from LA, or really Burbank, to Tachikawa Air Force Base via Hawaii, we first went to Travis Air Force Base and picked up a load of military people who were on their way to Korea via Japan. So we first went to Travis, then we went to Hawaii, then I think we might have even gone to, I think we might have stopped at Wake Island. And so that was the first time that I had flown on one of the airplanes for the military like that. But it really was not a successful industry at that time. And the reason it wasn't successful was because everything was open to bid, and there was always somebody near broke. And so when these are open for bid, and this still happens in almost every industry, in particular in the construction industry this happens, there's always a low bidder who typically goes broke on the job. Well, what was happening is because there were other supplemental carriers, it wasn't hard to get a certificate. They cost next to nothing because these guys were constantly going broke. Somebody could buy a certificate for $10,000. But if you didn't know how to run your airline, you'd go broke. It was only a question of how long it took. But as a result, you were constantly having to compete with people who were in the process of going broke, meaning they don't have to pay all their bills. And so it made it a very difficult industry. It would have died a natural death. The supplemental carrier industry would have died a natural death except for the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War resulted in a demand that was insatiable for airlift, for passengers, and for freight. We talked earlier about the Flying Tiger line. Trans-International Airlines was Kirk Kerkorian's airline. Hal Cope was the director of operations. Kerkorian sold that to, I believe it was Studebaker Worthington. He got a pretty good piece of change for it. Of course, they couldn't run it. And then I think it went to Transamerica.
Transworld.
No, it was called Trans-International. Then it was called, I believe, you can correct me, I think they changed the name to Transamerica, I believe, because I think Transamerica got involved. But don't hold me to this, I'm not the historian here. Kerkorian eventually bought it back. And that's where he amassed his first real fortune, was because of the Vietnam War. That's where Flying Tiger Line amassed its substantial assets sufficient to do all the things that it did subsequent to that. The Vietnam War did that. There were other people. A guy by the name of Jesse Stallings had a company called Capitol, C-A-P-I-T-O-L, International Airways. Have you ever heard of that? Well, if you look it up, you will. Jesse Stallings was a pilot, I believe, for American Airlines. He lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was entrepreneurial, and he ended up with DC-862s, a lot of them. Why? Because the demand during the Vietnam War was so significant, anything that could fly, jet aircraft, carry passengers or freight, the government hired, quite literally. And so when you had that event, it forestalled the supplemental carriers becoming just a postscript. It was the Vietnam War that did that.
So if it wasn't for the war, then a lot of the airlines weren't going to be successful?
Well, I can tell you this, I can remember some of those men who became fantastically wealthy. I can remember them saying, being there, looking at my dad saying, you know, you don't know how lucky you were that you got put out of business. We're getting bled to death, and you walked away with a pile of money. Which he did, amazingly enough. Since this is a history story, I'll just tell you what I know.
And what we haven't done yet is introduced you and your dad in this, which we're going to have to at some point. Have you say, let me tell you about my dad, and here's who I am, so
Okay.
we can bring this all together.
Well, why don't we do that now? My name is Alan Weiss. My dad was Stan Weiss, who was a gentleman who got in the civil aviation business after World War II, right at the end of World War II. Here at Long Beach Airport is where it started for him. And a good deal of the people who really made something happen for the non-skeds, it was based, the non-skeds were really out of here. Burbank mostly Burbank Lockheed Air Terminal. A lot of those outfits ran out of there because they wanted to pull the passenger traffic out of Los Angeles, but they couldn't operate out of, it wasn't called LAX back then, it was called Mines Field, I believe. Long ago it was called Mines Field, out there by the ocean where LAX now. But in any event, that's where a lot of these people got started. And each of us who's had the good fortune to have parents, and particularly parents who could teach you something about life, whether it's principles, whether you want to call it ethics, character, it doesn't matter what you call it, morality. There are certain things that happen in business because there is such a thing as morality in business, just like there is in every other aspect of human endeavor, just as there's immorality, and then I guess a large pile in the middle called amorality, where there is no good, there is no bad, there's just what works. In any event, I can remember my dad telling me, you always leave something on the table. You never take it all, no matter what your strength is. You always leave something on the table for the other guy because you never know, but you might not have to go back. So you always leave something on the table. And the perfect example of this is what happened to him. I told you he got run out of business. That's a fact. When he had run out of business, he had not even completed receiving all of his new aircraft from Douglas Aircraft. He still had aircraft on order, and he still owed millions of dollars to the bank. It was Bank of America. And he had nothing to do with those what was he going to do with the airplanes? He couldn't fly them anymore. Well, it turns out that in the early 50s, whether you want to call it Standard, which had DC-3s, C-47s, DC-3s, Viking had DC-3s. As they developed, they went to C-54s, which were DC-4s. But those weren't pressurized. They're 4-engine, unpressurized aircraft, carry around 80 people. During the time that North American had C-54s, DC-4s, their business had mushroomed. They could not keep enough aircraft. They were constantly expanding. And at that time, Eastern Airlines, which was run by Eddie Rickenbacker, the World War I ace, was moving out of DC-4s and into the pressurized equipment. And my dad made a deal with Captain Rickenbacker. It turns out he was called Captain. Anybody who knew him, who did business with him, called him Captain. And Rickenbacker had a fleet of DC-4s he wanted to get rid of. And so my dad negotiated a deal with him to buy those aircraft. And that would have been in the early 50s. Rickenbacker said, okay, but I'm not going to do any deal with you unless you buy all my spare parts. I assume you all know the importance of spares in the airline business. Okay. And my dad said, well, I don't need any spare parts. And Rickenbacker said, well, I don't either, because you're buying all those airplanes. If you want those airplanes, you're going to have to buy the parts. And so my dad bought the parts. Before those aircraft were delivered, there had been a lot of political pressure in the Northeast by people, the flying public, complaining about Eastern Airlines because it almost had the franchise for flying passengers in the Northeast. There was so much political pressure brought upon Eastern Airlines to provide more service that Eastern really couldn't let go of those airplanes. And so Captain Rickenbacker contacted my dad. He said, you know, we have to do something. I can't give you those airplanes. And my dad said, well, Captain, you know, I've already committed some of those aircraft, but I'll see what I can do to get some of them back. I put some out on lease in expectation you're going to deliver them to me, and then I will put them into my fleet. And Rickenbacker said, well, you know, I can't let you have those aircraft. I have to have those aircraft. This has to do with my certificate, and the general public is not going to allow, and I've already been told by the CAB, you know, that I have to provide more service. So anyway, my dad got the aircraft back. Mind you, they'd never left Eastern. Eastern still had them physically. And so they made the deal that my dad would lease those aircraft back to Eastern Airlines. And so after they made the deal on the lease, that, by the way, that was the first sale leaseback of airline equipment in the industry. And it was by accident because of the political pressure, because people wanted more service in their areas. So my dad said to Captain Rickenbacker, well, now that you have all those airplanes, what are you going to use for parts?
This is brilliant.
And Captain Rickenbacker said, well, I have a whole warehouse of parts. And my dad said, Captain, are you sure about that? And all of a sudden, apparently Captain Rickenbacker could swear a blue streak, a very profane man, very outspoken, so I'm told. Rickenbacker said, okay, you've got me. How much damage are you going to do to me? How bad is it? And my dad said to him, Captain, are those parts really worth that $1 million you charged me for them? And Rickenbacker apparently reared up and said, you calling me a liar and this and that? My dad said, no, I just want to make sure we understand each other. Are they really worth that $1 million? And he said, you're damn right they are, and whatever else he said. And my dad said, well, Captain, if that's what they're worth, that's what you can have them for. And Rickenbacker was incredulous and said, I don't understand. Well, Captain, I paid you $1 million for them, and you can have them back for the same $1 million. And Rickenbacker said, I don't understand. And my dad's response was, Captain, you're the one that made me take the parts. I told you I didn't need the parts. If that's what it cost me to get the airplanes, that's what it cost me to get the airplanes. Whatever I do with the parts, I do with the parts, but I didn't need the parts. I still don't need the parts. And Rickenbacker said, that's not acceptable. And my dad said, what do you mean it's not acceptable? And Rickenbacker said, you took the chance, we made a deal, and I'm not going to take them back for free. $1 million is free because you paid me that. That's not fair to you. I won't do that. And my dad said, Captain, I told you, I'm happy just to have the airplanes. And Rickenbacker said, I won't accept that. So the deal they made was that at the end of the lease, when Eastern was letting go of the aircraft, my dad said, Captain, just give me the QECs. Do you all know what a QEC is? It's a quick engine change. It's the engine connected to the mount where all you have to do is bolt it to the firewall and attach whatever the accessories are. And so at the end of that lease, my dad got all the QECs, and that was the end of that deal. Now that was, let's say, 1952-53. So my dad's ordered out of business. He doesn't know where he's going to get the money. I can't tell you the sleepless nights I saw in our home over that, wondering where he's going to get the money to pay the bank, what he's going to do with those airplanes. And wouldn't you know it, as those airplanes came off the line from Douglas, they came off with an Eastern Airlines paint job, because he ended up leasing all of his DC-6Bs, all of them, to Eastern Airlines. Why? Captain, are those parts really worth $1 million? All from that. If you ever want to see a lesson about not taking it all, that is an object lesson. And as I told you, Bill, after that, after they made the deal, Rickenbacker said, okay, this is for the 6Bs. It's all inked. He said, now I want to talk about real business with you, Stan. I want you to run Eastern Airlines. And he was offered the presidency of Eastern Airlines, which my dad didn't take. He said, Captain, I don't see that I can do that. You've made me a wealthy man, and I don't really want to work for someone. All of that from not taking it all.
Wow.
Very interesting.
Great story.
It's an incredible story.
One of the things that I've seen, if I can cut into the questions here for a bit, one of the things that I've seen throughout the storylines, throughout the history, is that the players were gentlemen for most parts. They were firm businessmen, but they worked on a handshake, and they supported each other in many of these venues. And that is what I've heard, and I see it. It's strong business, but honor. And I'm going to call it a family, because they seem to have a family going forward. That's the group I'm hearing and seeing more and more. And have you guys seen any different as we go through this?
There's a lot of respect with everybody.
Well, let me put some meat on those bones. Bob Prescott, Flying Tiger Line. As I said, Flying Tiger Line started here, their hangar and my dad's hangar right next to each other. They both moved their bases of operation to Lockheed Air Terminal, Burbank Airport. Over the years, they would continue to make deals between themselves, my dad and Bob, buying aircraft, selling aircraft, leasing aircraft. Whatever the deal was, I saw this, personally saw this happen. I remember the phrase, whether it was my dad or Bob, but I remember one in particular. Bob said, Stan, we need to talk about this deal. It's just not going to work right. And my dad said, what are you talking about? He said, well, Stan, we need to reshuffle the deck. That was the phrase. We need to reshuffle the deck, as in cards. And they started a new game, and they made a whole new deal that would work for both of them. Do you guys know who Pacific Southwest Airlines was?
I heard of it, but I don't know too much
Well, PSA was an outfit that was started in about 1951 or 52 by a guy by the name of Kenny Friedkin, who had a flying school down in San Diego. PSA became the large intrastate carrier in California. It was bought by U.S. Airways, I'm going to say 25 years ago, but it became a very, very successful airline. They ended up with 727, all the way up to 727-200s, and lots of them. When I first got out of law school, I worked for my dad. I passed the bar, but I really didn't want to be an attorney. And we ended up representing PSA in disposing of 727-200s, 100s, DC-930s, and I traveled in different parts of the world to do that. The genesis of that, at that point in time, PSA was a very significant airline in terms of revenues. They had a leasing company called Jet Air Domestic Leasing. They owned a lot of 727-200s. The airline started, as I say, in the early 50s, just before the Korean War. I mentioned to you about phasing out the DC-3s in my dad's airline. He had 2 DC-3s left. They were in for major overhaul, so they'd come out with 0 hours. Airframe engines, totally 0 hours. Kenny Friedkin wanted to start his airline, and he made a deal to buy those airplanes for $90,000 each. And now this is if you can picture this is a deal for $90,000 each, and after the deal was concluded, and nothing in writing, the Korean War broke out. The value of those airplanes went to $400,000 each. So Kenny Friedkin is calling almost daily about where are they in the overhaul, when are they going to be done, and this and that. And ultimately, my dad said, look, Kenny, I understand that you're concerned. The deal is a deal. It was $90,000. It's $90,000. You don't need to worry about that. You got your deal. Ultimately, before those planes were ever done, Friedkin said, I've got to come up and give you the money. I can't sleep at night. I can't sleep at night. And so he came and paid the $180,000 for the $800,000 worth of airplanes, just so he could sleep at night. That's how PSA got started. I went off to college in 1961, so I was the campus rep for PSA when I was off at college, because my dad essentially had financed them and then delivered the airplanes. And after that, as far as they were concerned, you know, he really was, I don't know what you call him, a mentor or whatever, but he got them started, and again, profit had nothing to do with it. The 90 was the 90, that's the deal. That's what you're talking about. Another example that's, I think, more meaningful in the global sense, because if the bookends of life are birth and death, what we're really interested in is the journey between the two. This man, Jesse Stallings, whom I mentioned, became tremendously successful in terms of money and lived a good life. He lived in Nashville, Tennessee. He had by the time he was really rolling, this is as a result of the Vietnam War, flying these planes absolutely day and night. You know, they never stopped. They just kept going, except for maintenance, because there was such a demand for airlift. Well, you can imagine the kind of money these airlines made. He had about a 4,000-acre spread in Tennessee for raising prize cattle. He had a jet strip on there. At the time he had it, which was considered a pretty decent airplane. I think he had a Lear 24 or 25. He had the flags of all the countries that he'd visited on the side of it, and he kept it at his farm because he had his jet strip on his farm. So we would go back to Tennessee on a regular basis because we had and still have a family farm near Nashville. So when we go back there, my dad would always go over to see Jesse. Well, I'm going to say this was maybe I was about your age. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say mid-70s. And we were in Tennessee, and my dad called, ended up talking to Jesse's wife. And she said, he can't come to the phone, but it would be wonderful if you could come to see him. So we went over there. They had this palatial home in a part of the older part of Nashville, out by the Belmead Country Club. It goes back to an antebellum plantation that was there, and this is a beautiful area, very stately homes. So we pull up to their home. It was a beautiful home. And we come in, the wife takes us off to the servants' quarters, and there lying on the bed in the servants' quarters is Jesse Stallings. And so I'm standing at the door. My dad sticks his neck in the door and says, "Jesse," and this Jesse responded in a very, very weakened voice. He said, "Who is it? Who is it?" "Jesse, it's Stan." So Jesse said, "Stan, come over here." And so he had my dad sit down to him right next to his bed. And I remember it as if I were there today. Jesse said, "Stan, give me your hand." And Jesse's flat out, and he's blind. He can't see. And he takes my dad's hand, and he says, "The doctors tell me I'm getting better." Now this will tell you how good of friends my dad and Jesse were. You talk about the brotherhood.
Yeah.
"Jesse, I don't think so. It looks to me like you're dying." And Jesse said, "I know." And so my dad said, "Jesse, I don't know what to say. Think about all of the battles, how many people have tried to put us out of business and have succeeded again and again, and how hard you fought. And here, now that you've really got it made, that nobody can touch you, this is what happens." And I remember Jesse, mind you, blind, looking up at him and saying, "Stan, I'd give it all if I could only see you now." So for all of these stories about all of these people, it's still a human equation. And it's all about the journey. So these guys that we're talking about, you know, every person is exceptional. We know that. Having said that, there are those few among us who are more exceptional than others. And these are some of them. You'll find in every aspect of human endeavor. This is only one. In every aspect of human endeavor, you find this. It's the same story, just a little different plot. And one of the names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Well, if we could go back to how your dad actually started. I know you said he bought the 2 planes, and can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. There was no underlying demand for air travel. The way these guys got started, they got the airplanes, and right over here is Los Alamitos Naval Air Station. Have you ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. Well, when these soldiers and sailors were returning home and separated from the service, they had to get home, wherever home was. And so, in my dad's case, but it's not unique to him, in my dad's case, there was a travel agency in town called in Long Beach called CF Beach. And CF Beach has started that, I guess, in the 20s or 30s, because I remember the son, Al Beach, he'd be about my dad's age. And I learned this from Al Beach, really more than I did from my dad. CF Beach and Al Beach would sell tickets, airplane tickets, really just seats, going to St. Louis, going to this and that. So basically, they would have a flight, and they would promote the flight to the returning veterans. And then the planes would fly from Los Alamitos Naval Air Station and take the veterans and fly them wherever they were going. And so these really were just one step above a charter to get to get the passengers from here to wherever. And what's a DC-3 carry? 30 people, maybe. And so that's how they got started. And then, as I mentioned to you, they were doing the junkets at night. And then, as the United States after the war probably became more civilianized, and now the economy started to come up, and the demand came for air carriage, and it was an opportunity, as I mentioned, because the major carriers, you had to be wealthy or work for a business to fly. And basically their philosophy was, if you can't afford it, you don't need to fly. And so these carriers that came up, such as my dad, really were probably more of a flying bus line than anything. To start with, a la Southwest. Southwest is like getting on a bus. And so that's how they got started. And so with the boom in the U.S. economy and how do you say it? There's no form of transportation that is as economical as air transportation. It's not the bus. If you figure out forget the time consumption, how about just the meals? How about all of the incidental expenses with a bus for flying long distance, and yet you can get on an airplane, and when they used to give you a meal, you don't even get hungry. And so the only thing you did was pay for the airplane ticket. So that's how the airline got started, and even though they had a great deal of competition, as I said, the major trunk carriers, they brought the price down. It didn't matter. What's the expression? The firstest with the mostest. It's still the case in any industry almost. If you get there first and build loyalty and an identity, it's almost impossible for somebody to ever catch up with you unless you allow them to. And that is how it developed. My dad's airline was the most successful. I say my dad's. He had partners. That was the most successful of any of the non-skeds. You may know that, you may not know that. But if you call successful, numbers of aircraft, passengers flown.
And can you give us some idea? Well, what was the size?
Oh, they had under 20 airplanes.
Okay.
But they were flying them, as I told Bill, they set the records for Douglas Aircraft on the 6Bs. They were flying those planes over 13 hours a day, which was it was almost 200% of what the majors were using their aircraft. So they were flying the heck out of their airplanes.
Mm-hmm. That's how an airplane makes you money.
It's the only way. I learned very early from him what the importance of break-even is. You know, you got to get to break-even, whatever it is. His philosophy was, Alan, believe me, an empty seat on an airplane is a seat that's lost forever. It won't ever appear again. You have to fill that seat. You must fill the seat. So anyway, that's how they got started. And because once you get up and going, when they couldn't, do you think the trunks would have used politics to put them out of business if they could have done it any other way? No. They couldn't put them out of business, so they politicked them out of business. Does it really matter? You know, it's hard to say. The CAB went away in any event. And so the airlines put themselves out of business. Think about it. Who would have ever believed that of the major trunk carriers, American Airlines today is the only one that hasn't gone through bankruptcy? Who would believe that? That's like somebody saying, who would believe GM would go broke? It's of the same significance. But it goes back to the old adage that, you know, the one constant in life is change. And what happened was, perfect example, Pan Am. Look how long ago Pan Am went out. There was a time in international civil aviation that Pan Am was the gold standard, and Pan Am trained more airlines throughout the world than any one other entity that trained pilots for airlines all over the world. Pan Am and TWA, you guys may know this, were unofficial agents of the U.S. government for renditions. Did you know that?
I heard a few things about that, yeah.
You know what rendition is?
No.
Well, that's what the big stink is now as far as dealing with the Taliban and various people. Rendition is when you snatch somebody and you bring them back to where you can do with them what you want when it's outside of your country. Well, Pan Am was all over the world. Mm-hmm. So Pan Am was an unofficial agent of the U.S. government, and when they would snatch somebody, that person would be put on a Pan Am airplane and returned to wherever the government wanted him. I'll tell you something else too. This is an adjunct, but it's really important. There were two men, their last name was Drew. They had a contract in the mid-50s, the late 50s with the UN. They had cargo aircraft. There was, in the Belgian Congo, there was a secessionist province called Katanga. Katanga had mines for strategic minerals. It was in the interest of the US government to have that succession succeed. The UN had its peacekeepers in the Congo. The Druze were talked into carrying dismantled fighter planes in their airplanes that were contracted to the UN that's supposed to be overseeing all of this, and it was. The UN was not complicit in this. These men who had this cargo carriage, one of their airplanes was caught with a fighter plane in it. It broke them. Now, they had been prevailed upon by agents of the US government to carry those in there for the benefit of the United States. Do you think anybody ever acknowledged anything? Do you think anybody ever lifted a finger to do anything to help those people? They were finished. That was the end of their business. I know that when I was a boy, and again, this sounds, you know, this, you can accept it or not. In Mexico, there still are tribes of Indians in certain states of Mexico, and they had gold mines. And I know that my dad was approached by people who said they were agents of the US government to fly down into Mexico and land at prepared dirt airstrips to pick up plane loads of gold that supposedly was being bought from the Indians for the United States. He wouldn't do it.
Does he know anybody that did?
I don't know, but he didn't. Yeah. Your friend Hal Cope, did he tell you about when he had an FBO there in Kenya?
In Kenya.
Did he tell you how he had to leave?
No, he has never mentioned how he had to leave. I just know that he did elephant reconnaissance flights.
That's okay. He had to leave. He had an FBO there. It was a Cessna FBO. And Jomo Kenyatta was the father of modern Kenya. He led the revolt there and was considered not a, it would be very much akin to Mandela. So somebody who really highly regarded, not of a Mugabe type. So truly, of Kenya, he was the George Washington of Kenya. Hal Cope was the pilot who would fly Kenyatta around Kenya because that was the FBO. And of course that meant that Hal Cope knew wherever Mr. Kenyatta was going and whatever he was doing, I guess, since he was his pilot. Then all of a sudden Hal had to leave Kenya. You'd have to ask Hal why. He didn't do anything bad. It's not that. It's just the way things are.
Well, I do know he lost a close friend, fellow pilot, to 226 in my mind. I'm trying to remember. During one of the revolutions, he lost somebody, and I'm trying to remember one of the, I guess you'd call them chieftains of one of the tribes. And it's a common name, and it's just eluding me right now. A tyrant, though.
You know, it's interesting. We're talking about Africa, not the United States, but you'll find that the nature of aviation being what it is, it's unique in its position that takes you right to the heart of whatever's making things happen wherever you go in the world. It's unique to aviation. Before airplanes, it would have been ships. It would have been the same deal.
It's a great statement. That's true.
You know, a lot of people don't think about that.
As we go through and we look at your time period, and here's one of the pluses, is I realize that we probably have 20 more hours worth of videotaping that we could do. But we won't do that to you today.
Good.
Because I know your time, you'd mentioned that you had until roughly 3:30 today.
Right.
And I want to make sure that you've had some opportunity to look at the questions that we had. We haven't asked every question yet. But I want to make sure we catch your core of the essence too. And the thing that you want us to most know about, not only your dad, any industry, but I think that's an important part. It's keeping to the personal level of when we look at the character of the men and women in the industry and the risk-taking. But I think to make sure we don't lose that piece here. I mean, I see your dad as an honorable businessman. And you'd mentioned in our telephone conversations, he was a great father and he flew to work every day. If you could elaborate a little bit more on this man who truly was a good father, an excellent father, an aviator, bled hydraulic fluid is what I'm understanding. And what I saw in talking to some of the others is we have individuals who wanted to be pilots and then they became businessmen. And that's always a dichotomy at times because one led to the other. And they were, because of their risk-taking ability, because they were sharp, they were willing, they advanced well into the career. But just about everyone that I met started out as, I don't want to own an airline, I want to be a pilot. And then it grew. Is that a fair statement to say? And can you elaborate on that?
Well, I can speak in general, then I get specific. What you're talking about, Bill, is the fact that there will always be among us survivors. And what I mean by that is this. They were pilots, most of them. Some weren't, some were not, but most were, that came out of World War II anyway. My dad, I think, to me, said it best. One time, in retrospect, he said, "You know, son, I have to tell you something. If I'd have known what I was getting into, I'd have run as fast as I could in the other direction. It would have scared me to death." And I think that probably describes most of these people. That is, they were survivors, as I say, and events, I guess the question is, do events overcome us or do we overcome the events? And the survivor, I think, is the one who overcomes the events. And so a lot of these people, probably, it's like wanting to be a rock musician. How many try and how few succeed? So we don't hear about the people that tried and just fell along the wayside in exactly what we're talking about here. The numbers have to be overwhelming, the people that tried and didn't make it. And so that's why I use the word survivor. Some of it, my dad was a man of, I think, significant integrity. I remember him telling me once, it doesn't matter, son, it doesn't matter if you're the first of our generation in this city or you've had 5 generations where you live. There is nothing as important as the value of your good name. And whether you're the one that is responsible for building that value or whether generations ahead of you are also responsible for building that value, it doesn't matter how long it took, you can lose it that fast. And that's really just one aspect of integrity. So getting back to the survivors, we've all seen things. We may have experienced them. There are plenty of people who survive by walking over the bodies of others, or by sleight of hand, or by any other form of chicanery, or whatever you want to call it. There are those kinds of survivors. Let's call that at one extreme. And probably the other extreme would be a survivor who really somehow still is the guy wearing the white suit, riding the white horse, but has, the biggest herd of horses because he earned them the honest way. There are people like that, but that's also a very small number, and the rest of us probably fit in between. But the reality is this, you have to be a survivor. And so in the aviation industry, certainly the non-SCADs, which is your focus, You didn't just have to survive natural disasters. You had to survive intentional, man-made disasters, roadblocks, landmines, and everything else. I can tell you, I didn't see it, but I've heard of it, where equipment has been parked on the end of a runway so somebody's airliner couldn't land at that airport on that particular event. Things that happened that people would find very hard to believe, yet they happened. So when you ask me about my dad, you know, this is through my eyes. One of the benefits of when we start to mature is somewhere along the line, our view of our parents starts to become at least somewhat more objective, starting to see them as the person he or she really is, and accepting them because of who they are and that you love them. And so, given the benefit of where I am in my life now, and still having the recall of everything, I can tell you this: there's never been a place that I've been where being his son and having the experiences I've had hasn't helped me. If there are people who know him, in business with him, all I can tell you is I've been the beneficiary of a great deal of goodwill because of all of that. And again, like I said earlier, you know, you always leave something on the table. Another thing he told me that's really of the same significance: there will come times when you will make such a good deal that you just hardly can't believe it and can't stand it. And the one thing you must not do, Alan, you never let the other guy know how bad you got him. Never do that. Never, ever. Because again, you may see him again. You don't need to do that. Just keep it to yourself. I can think of an event like that. When I was in law school, which would have been the late 60s, I traveled to quite a bit because, again, I had worked for PSA, and then also Flying Tiger Line gave me, I had an ID card for Flying Tiger Line, so I could go all over the world because I was with Flying Tiger Line. And so a friend of mine in school with me, he and I were in Hong Kong. And a man by the name of John Bremeridge, at the time was the managing director of Cathay Pacific Airways, which is a big airline. And it turns out Cathay Pacific Airways was owned by a company called Butterfield and Swire. Well, Butterfield and Swire, if you ever read the book Taipan, which goes back to, all right, Butterfield and Swire was one of the few of the English trading companies that started out with sea captains. And so Butterfield and Swire, when I was there, they owned, you know, the Coca-Cola company. They owned significant amounts of the real estate in Hong Kong. They owned Cathay Pacific Airways. They owned all of these things that all blossomed from the original time of those first trading captains being there. And so John Bremeridge, who actually after that became the Minister of Finance for Hong Kong. But at the time, he was the managing director of Cathay Pacific, which means he was the CEO. And they had 2 Lockheed Electras. And my dad bought one of them. He tried to get 2. But they, because of where they were located in Hong Kong, they had to have sufficient spare parts to be able to operate those 2 Electras without having to go anywhere to get spare parts because they were at the other end of the world from here. So they had this tremendous supply of spare parts. And if you know much about aircraft, which it sounds like you do, certain parts are called rotables. You know what that means? Cycles, hours. And so many cycles, so many hours, they have to be overhauled. Landing gear, propellers, engines. Now these, of course, turbine engines, but it doesn't matter. It's still, they're rotables. And so the deal my dad made with Cathay Pacific was, I'm buying the aircraft as of this date for future delivery, because they were still flying it. The 2 airplanes, only 2. here's your inventory of spare parts. It has so many zero engines, so many zero props, so many zero landing gears. That's what I'm buying from you. And this had all happened before I had been there. So that was the contract. He got this many zero-time rotables plus all the other spares. So we're there in 1967, my friend and I, and so Mr. Brimridge had us to his home for a barbecue. And he started talking to me. He said, you know, I really have a problem I need to discuss with you. And I said, well, what is it? I was in my early 20s at the time. He said, well, your dad really got to me. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I made this contract and all these spare parts, we've had to lease the airplane back from your father because we didn't get delivery of the replacement equipment. And my people tell me that I now no longer have X number of zero-time engines, propellers, or landing gear because we're continuing to maintain the aircraft. And I'm going to have to deliver these parts with 000, and I'm told it's going to cost me a fortune to do that. And I remember telling him, I said, well, I don't work for my father, but I can tell you this. If there's a way that it can be worked out that it doesn't seriously injure you, I think you need to talk to him because I know him. And if you discuss it with him, you'll come up with something you can both live with. Now, here's what happened. I went home, I explained the story to my dad. He said, yeah, I knew that was going to happen. And the deal they made was, my dad went and found a buyer of the aircraft with all the spares, but in his deal, the buyer had to take the spares as is. So now, he can just go back to Cathay Pacific and make a deal they can both live with, and they'll go down the road. So afterward, my dad was trying to explain something to me. He said, you have to understand something, Alan. When you look at these deals, you always have to have an exit strategy. Going in, you must have an exit strategy. Alan, that deal I made with them, I bought that package based on the parts and figured I could throw the airplane away and do just fine. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I got the airplane for free. So when I was able to make the deal, it was to an outfit called Equatoriana, which was a national carrier in Ecuador. When I made the deal with Equatoriana, I'd already sealed the fate on the whole deal. I could afford to be generous. And so that's what they did. And the deal just went down the road. Everybody was happy. It's how you learn about things. I was very fortunate because I was interested and he would take me on these business trips. For you guys, if you get in business or in anything, I can remember being at meetings and then, I think it was 16, 17, we were in New York. We're riding back to the hotel in a cab, and my dad said to me, Alan, why do you think Mr. Such-and-so said whatever it was he said? I said, well, I don't remember that. And he looked at me and said, aren't you listening? I said, well, he said, Alan, I didn't ask you to come on this trip with me. You asked me to bring you. So if I bring you on a trip, I want you to listen to what people are saying. Let me explain something to you. Nobody says anything for no reason. Nobody. You listen to what they say. You don't listen to just what they tell you they want. Listen to what they say, because it can be very different from what they tell you they want. And you have to take everything in and then come to your own conclusion as to what they really mean. Very interesting. But you see, so I want to talk about my dad. It just happened that he liked aviation. No, he loved aviation. As a matter of fact, unfortunately for him, really, he was not, it wasn't that he was an unhappy man, but he was unfulfilled the rest of his life once he got out of the aviation business. He was unfulfilled. Now what's interesting, he became a very large shareholder in Flying Tiger Line. He was a large shareholder. And I can remember one time that he was asked by Bob Prescott, well, don't you want to be on the board of directors? And my dad said, no thanks, I don't want to be on the board. So I said to my dad later, and by this time I think I was in law school. I said, why wouldn't you want to be on the board? He said, do I look that stupid? I said, what are you talking about? He said, Alan, I'm a very large shareholder in the airline. I'm not on the board. I can buy and sell that stock. I can do whatever I want. As soon as I'm on the board, I'm finished. I can't do anything. I would never be on that board. Ever. Another thing with Flying Tiger Line, they made all of this money. So in the late 60s, they had, I don't know how many $100 million in cash. And I was there, and Bob Prescott said, well, Stan, if you had all that money, what would you do? What would you do with that money? And my dad looked at me and said, I know exactly what I'd do with that money. Well, what would you do? I'd go right up to Renton, Washington, and I would buy as many 727-200s garden variety that any airline in the world could use and sit on them, because you'll never ever receive one of those airplanes off of that production line that doesn't already have a home. And that's how they got in the aircraft leasing business. That's what they did with the money. Then they hooked up with a guy by the name of Wayne Hoffman, who came out of the railroad industry, and they bought a company called, I think, the North American Rail Car, I don't remember the exact name, so they became one of the largest lessors of railroad cars in the country too, with that money they made. So they changed the whole dynamic. So the fact that they started in one business, you could translate. I guess what I'm telling you is it just happens that these people were in this particular industry. It gets back to what you were saying, Bill, and that is there are some of us more capable than others in all different aspects of human endeavor. So each of us, when we're with our friends, with our peers, we can all think of sometime we see something that's as evident as that picture right there and nobody else sees it. But we do. I can remember my dad telling me, Alan, if there's anyone who says to you, there just aren't the opportunities there used to be, you don't walk away from them, you run. Because that will never be so. There are only more and more and more opportunities. That's not the question. That's a given. The question is, do you see it as such? And even if you answer that question right, what do you do with it?
And actually, Hal Cope gave me the book, The Next 100 Years. And Hal, every time we meet, Hal's component is, so what is the next opening? He's probably talked to you. You might have seen it. He was talking about 3 parts hydrogen the other day when I showed him something in one of our labs. And his deal is, Bill, this could be the next fuel. Who do you have working on this? He doesn't stop. And that's what I look at, and I see the vision that so many people had back then. It's the vision and the ability to say, this will work.
They still have it. I mean, Google? I mean, who would have put money in Google with a name like that? How many people did? I don't know anybody who did.
I don't know anyone who did.
It's a perfect example. So, again, there are only more and more opportunities. Believe me, the opportunities that present themselves today compared to when we were in school are a magnitude greater. But who sees it? And of those who see it, who grabs onto it and makes something of it? I mean, these are the things you don't really know. And it's going to continue to be more so, not less so. It'll be more so. What's so interesting is that, see, you all have a focus because of your interest in aviation. For me, I've got an advantage because I grew up in it. My brother became an airline pilot. I still remember the first flight that he did, commercial flight, when he was an engineer And they went out of LAX, and I think they went to Anchorage, and then I think they went to Tokyo, and then Kaohsiung. The reason I know this, I remember sitting at the table at my folks' home. By that time, of course, my dad's out of the aviation business, and basically, he still bought and sold airplanes, leased airplanes, but that's a different issue. My dad was hanging on every word, as if he were with my brother on this thing, this whole trip. So my brother's talking about this trip, and he's almost glassy-eyed, talking about going from here to here to here. And then he took a moment to take a deep breath, my brother, and he said, "And they pay me too." That's what you're talking about. The guys that would do it anyway, they aren't doing it for the money. They're doing it for something else. Think of all the guys you know around the airport that it costs them money. I don't mean somebody paying money to get lessons. I mean somebody that's doing something to work on a ramp or to do this or that. Because you kind of did that, didn't you? Sounds like when. So you could have done many other things. There's a serious opportunity cost. I'll call it an opportunity cost, where people say, well, no, I'm going to go do that rather than this, even though, this might be easier, it might pay me more, or whatever. And they do that. And so when you have this interest in aviation, you're very fortunate to have that, because a small group of people do. Most people really don't know. They're clueless. They read this thing about this 737-400 that has the, I'll call it a rent. I mean, it didn't really open up or anything, thank God. But to them, they could be terrorized reading about it. I'm sure if I were on the airplane, I'd be terrorized. But that isn't the point. The point is, anybody who's been around airplanes any period of time, oh yeah, I understand that. Oh yeah, boy, they're lucky that nothing worse happened, and they're going to fix that. And then, so how many of the airplanes that needed work? It's a matter of days, the plane's put back in operation, and there's really no difference. You know that. Matter of fact, if anything, that area of the plane might become too strong as compared to the rest of it. You have to be careful of that. But people who don't understand aviation wouldn't know that, just as we don't understand whatever it is, computers or this or that. And so this is not an issue of history, what we're talking about now. It's just about a common interest in aviation. I mean, look at the difference in ages. I'm older, you're younger than I am, but you're a lot older than these two, and then you're slightly more experienced than these two.
That was kind. I have another question about your father's business. In terms of, I don't know how many non-skid airlines there were, but your father's company was successful, and that set it apart in any industry. Which components of an airline did he keep in-house, and which did he farm out, so to speak? I mean, they probably hired flight attendants. What about maintenance? How did a smart operator organize their business?
Well, they ran everything in-house that they could. They even had their own print shop for doing their ticket stock and everything. See, one of the reasons that people went, in Detroit, for example, outsourcing, Detroit, the major airlines now. Why? Because of unions. Because over a period of time, with somewhat along the lines of public employee unions now, if you continue to accede, if you continue to give in for the short-term avoidance of a strike or this or that, at some point it becomes more weight than the horse can bear. And that's the case of an airline or a manufacturing company or a city or a county or a state or a national government. Because most people will give in for the immediate satisfaction of the immediate need rather than dealing with the long term. My dad's airline they had their own union. Matter of fact, I remember early on, and this is probably predictable, human nature. Because they were growing and fighting all these battles, even though they were generating a lot of money, the airline, these men weren't getting rich that owned the airline because they were plowing it back in and buying new equipment. The union people, early on, the pilots union, had certain demands. Hal can tell you about this. And my dad said, look, you must think that money's falling off the trees here, and it isn't. We'll show you our books. You know what the response was? Well, we know you have 2 sets of books. I mean, that was the first response out of the box. Rather than, well, show it to us, they just immediately went to this, well, you have 2 sets of books. So getting back to what you're saying, Sally, or what you're asking, back then, anything that they would sublet would cost them more than if they could do it themselves as best they could. They did, by the way. I can remember TV dinners when that was a big deal? Okay.
Swanson's.
Exactly. I remember that because the airline, my dad would bring these things home for us to try this, because they were subletting for the TV dinners, for the meals to feed the people on the airplanes. So they didn't have their own kitchen. They were subletting that. But they had their own flight crews. They had their own cabin attendants. I think they did their own flight training. They did all their own maintenance. Because I can remember on Saturdays, we would fly up there. I can remember one time, my brother and I went up there on a Saturday. Well, Dad take us to work because he had to go on Saturday. And so we were up there, and they had just completed an overhaul on a DC-6B. And the plane was going to go flying from here to Las Vegas to Salt Lake City, or whatever it was going to do. And we asked if we could go. He said, as long as you're back by 5. And so we just hopped on the airplane and went. And then, came back. I can remember as a little boy, as a matter of fact, flying wherever the airliners would go. They would have us, we were little guys, they would have 2 pilots and an engineer up in the cockpit. They would set the bags that you put your Jepsons in such a way that they'd make a bed for us up there so we could sleep up there when we were flying somewhere, going from here to there as little guys. They did everything they could in-house.
What about like marketing?
Well, they had that fellow, as I say, they had an advertising agency, and so they marketed certainly television, print. I've got a big newspaper ad from, I think, the Los Angeles Herald. It was one of the papers here. Frank Sinatra, talk about advertising, marketing. Frank Sinatra in the early 50s was almost broke. He was broke. And he had fallen in love with Ava Gardner and given up all reason, had become an alcoholic, and was just a wreck. He and my dad had become friends by that time. They were friends. My dad would give Frank Sinatra his airplane and a pilot and fly Frank Sinatra different places if he needed to go somewhere. Not an airliner, didn't need that, but private plane. And at one point, Frank Sinatra said, I've got to do something in return. You've done all these things for me, Stan. And my dad said, well, that's what friends do. You don't have to return it. We're friends. You needed it? I'm happy to do that. Frank Sinatra had a song called Come Fly With Me. And it was written by Jimmy Van Heusen and Sammy Cahn, who were also people that my dad had known. Because my dad wouldn't take anything from Frank Sinatra, said, I don't want anything, we got a master disc of Come Fly With Me where they changed the lyrics to be an ad for Trans-American Airlines for free. And so that was played all over the country. Hi, this is Frank Sinatra talking about the airline and singing the song, having written it with the airline in it. For free.
Wow.
Because that's what he could do for his friend. When I was in, I'd forgotten about this. When I was 9th or 10th grade, if there was some girl I had a crush on, all I had to do was ask my dad, and I would get an autographed picture from Frank Sinatra. I remember the girl's name was Karen Keyes. Dear Karen, all my love, Frank. Didn't mean anything to the girl, but the mother loved it. Wouldn't you know? So you name it. They did everything.
It was a fraternity. It was a fraternity. And that's what you saw, was that they took care of each other. I said family before, but fraternity, I think, works.
Very interesting. They all knew each other. And some of them were sketchy. You understand that?
Yeah.
Right.
Probably more than some. A lot were sketchy. And you had to watch, you had to watch who you were dealing with. And other people, their word was their bond.
Do the external obstacles make those bonds stronger?
It's a good question, and the answer is yeah, it would have to. These guys were fighting. Remember I said survivors? They were fighting for survival because, believe me, can you imagine the David and the Goliath? It literally was David and Goliath. These guys that were running the major trunk carriers thought they could go like that, and they could pay for and purchase the power of the federal government to help them.
And they did.
And they did. Absolutely did. And yet some of these guys survived. But most of them, again, my dad was probably his group. They were the only ones that had sufficient audacity to spit in everybody's face, and they got put out of business for it. The other guys thought they were going to die a suffering but slow death, and the Vietnam War bailed them out and made them fantastically wealthy. Now, who'd have ever called that one? But that's what happened. And they were at the right place at the right time.
How does justice come out of all of this?
Well, okay. Now, you know what I do for a living.
Yes, I do.
It's not a definition of who I am, it's only what I do. Having said that, I came to grips a long time ago with the concept of justice. If somebody were to come into my office and their rallying call is, I want justice, I'd probably have a sphincter attack. Why? Because there is no such thing as justice in the abstract. Justice is the result of hard work and sacrifice, looking what appear to be overpowering threats in the face and not running away. And if you do all of that and you're halfway lucky, the result is justice. I hope you don't mind my saying that, and I'm not being a cynic. I'm being an idealist because I look at that as an idealist, and that's one of the reasons you fight for the right and you don't walk away. In my business, one of the benefits that's come at this point in my life is I don't have to do things just for money. And so if somebody needs some help from time to time, I'm just the guy that can do it. And so that occurs from time to time, and it's one of the rewards of doing what it is I do. So when you ask this question of justice, justice is, it's the panorama of life. Justice, it could be within this room. It could be within the hierarchy of your university. It could be within your work environment. It's something that is anywhere and everywhere, but it only occurs when people work to make it happen. It does not occur as a natural state. I really believe that. If you look in the world, I mean, this is an overstatement. There's predictability throughout the universe as we know it, except where we humans manage to touch it. There's order to everything until we get involved. So I guess what I'm saying is we have met the enemy and they are us. Since you got on the philosophical bent of justice. So it means different things to different people. That's like asking somebody what love means. Every person you ask, if they'll actually be honest with themselves and you, will give you a slightly different answer. Yet, in our own lives, it's not too hard to see or even do it ourselves. You make the utterance of a throwaway word, I love you. People do that. I know people that, that's in their vocabulary. I had a guy I worked with for years. Every time his wife called, when he hang up the phone, he'd say, "I love you." It was goodbye. To him, it was the same as saying goodbye. Now, he did love his wife, but to me, he had kind of put it into a wholesale concept of love. And so the question of justice, it's not quite the same, but it's a little bit like that, because we can talk in relatively superficial terms about justice, or we can get down to the reality of the circumstance. They're not necessarily the same.
Right.
Too much information?
No.
Never.
Okay.
I
As we
don't,
look, I was going to say, as we look at the time, there's a couple things I know that we haven't. We've gone a little bit longer. I think we've covered most things. We did not do a disclosure, so we need to make sure that we do a disclosure statement, or at least mail one. And being a lawyer, I think you understand it from the attorney's side.
Whatever you need.
And that's something we haven't done. And then the other thing is, I think we haven't promised you a deliverable, because I think there's value in this interview, not only for what we're doing for APA, but this is me stepping outside of this bounds. But I think there's value to you having this disc as well, and some of the footage that you've gotten for you and for your family, and for generations in the future, because there's things you've shared and talked about that probably have not gone through your family. And so it'd be good if we make sure that you get a copy of this.
That'd be great, Bill. I'm sure the kids would like it, as long as they don't have to listen to it while I'm alive.
And
They've heard enough from me already, believe me.
but I wanted to make sure that, and you were about to say something else, but I wanted to make sure we didn't go too much longer on everybody's time.
I was wondering if you could just sum up pretty briefly, out of everything that you've experienced and everything that your father has taught you, what could you pass on to me or the students, or anybody for that matter?
Actually, my response to Sally's question is probably the best thing he's taught me. Having said that, we've heard a lot about my father, but we haven't heard anything about my mother, have we?
No.
To tell you that he was a man among men is an understatement. So let's just say that's there, and that it's there, and say no more. Would it surprise you that he would have said to me, "Son, believe me, if it weren't for your mother, I'd be nothing"?
There's a really great quote, behind every great man is a great woman, or even greater woman, or something like that. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you look at that stuff. Very interesting. You'll appreciate this more than certainly the younger men. I remember as a kid that before my dad did business with someone new, he'd invite them to our home to have dinner with him and my mother. And she would, prepare the meal and so forth. And then they'd go their own ways, the individual or individuals. And then he'd say to my mother, "So Geneva, what do you think of those people?" Because he knew that she was a much better judge of the underlying character than he was. So that those people that came never knew that, but that's why they were coming to his home. Very interesting. So I learned a lot of things from them.
You shared her name. Can you share just a little bit more about your mom? And when were they married? How long were they married?
Let's see, I guess they were married over 50 years. Very interesting. He finished pharmacology school. He maintained his license, he maintained his pharmacy license in the state of New York until his death, matter of fact. As a matter of fact, when I was a little boy, there was a place in Long Beach called Hunter Drug Company, and he'd go down on Saturdays and roll pills because Lloyd Hunter was a friend of his, and he just wanted to go for the hobby of rolling pills Rolling pills is when you actually used a mortar and pestle and made the tablets. So even though he said he never wanted to roll another pill, I guess what he meant was I never want to have to do it for a living. But it didn't mean he didn't want to still roll a pill. So he would do that even while he's running this airline and going all over the world and up all sorts of crazy hours. His idea of fun would be on Saturday, go down there and make some medicine. Very interesting. But so anyhow, my mom, she really was something, and a very beautiful woman. He met her because he had finished pharmacology school and worked in a drugstore across the street from the bank where she worked. And her family was from Tennessee, that's why we have the farm there, but her parents had moved to New Jersey, and so she was working in New York City. And she worked for a lady by the name of Pearl Tupper, Aunt Pearl. I've never met her, but for Aunt Pearl, I wouldn't exist, because Aunt Pearl was my mother's boss, and when my dad was sending sandwiches over and all this stuff trying to promote my mother, and she wasn't interested, Pearl Tupper was the one that said, he's really a nice young man. Why don't you give him a chance? So I remember that we got presents and we would send thank you cards to Ms. Pearl Tupper. She never got married. 28 Nix Point Road, South Weymouth, Massachusetts. I still remember that.
Wow.
So anyhow, that's how he met my mom, because he was, when I was feeling my oats, I can remember a line he used to tell me when he could tell. I was thinking I was smarter than he was. I was probably 17 or 18, 16, whatever it was. I can remember him telling me, Alan, I know you think I'm a jerk, but believe me, I was a soda jerk way before I was a jerk. I still remember him telling me that. But it goes back that far, and so that's how they met, and then they moved here as a result of the war into Long Beach. And as I say, he went overseas and he came back here. And so.
Thank you for sharing it.
Absolutely.
Because that was a question that I had, because I hadn't heard anything about her, so I'm so glad you brought that in.
Well, probably the most important thing she ever told me, I was maybe in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and I came home and I was visibly upset. And she said, "What's wrong with you?" And I just blurted it out. "I hate him, I hate him, I hate him." I was talking about some kid in school who was a bully and had picked on another kid in the class, and I stepped in between the kid and the bully, and so the guy took me on and then started hitting me. And so I'm telling my mother how much I hate this kid, and she said, "Alan, hate is the most destructive force on this earth. You must hate no one. Alan, you need to step back. You need to try to understand, why did he do what he did? Why is he hurting so much? And if you take the time to try to understand why people do the things they do, your life will be much better." I'll close with one thing my dad told me, which is really accurate. He was a success as a human being. Most people say, well, he's a successful man or whatever, and they think they're talking money. Well, he didn't look at it that way. Maybe I was 18, and you guys remember this. He said, "Alan, if you remember what I'm going to tell you, your life's going to be simpler, happier, less fraught with upset and bad things. Alan, money has no intrinsic value whatsoever, none. I know what it is to have no money, and I know what it is to have more money than I could ever spend reasonably. I know both, and what I'm going to tell you applies across the board. Son, the only value money has is the utility of what it can do for you and those near and dear to you. That's the only value at all. And if you keep it in its place as a commodity and nothing more, you don't worship it, you don't You don't lie for it, you don't cheat for it, you don't steal for it, you don't give up your honor, you don't hurt your friends, you keep it where it is, your life is going to be a lot happier and simpler.
Very good.
Anyway.
I have to agree with that one. Very much so.
Well, he told me that a long time ago, and I still remember it so clearly, and the reason I do is because it repeats itself
Yeah.
again and again and again. We've all seen it. You know, it's like if you want to meet your potential worst enemy, when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, look in the mirror and say, hello. That's the way it is. Anyway, so in the first and last lesson.
I have a little token of appreciation for you.
Well, thank you. What is it?
It's a present.
Well, you.
It is a pen from Embry-Riddle,
Oh, great.
and it's a photo frame. But we were going to take your picture and print the photo and put it in the frame, but we couldn't do that. But we will send you a photo.
Perfect.
We're still going to.
Thank you.
We're still going to take a picture.
Thank you so much.